we are going to learn how to use a matrix for risk assessment. So let's talk about the steps to risk assessments. Number one is identify. We want to identify areas of actual and potential risk. Number two is determine. Determine the effect of the risk on personnel and your organization. Number three, evaluate. Evaluate risks and decide whether existing precautions are adequate. Number four, develop contingency plans for risks that cannot be eliminated. And number five is review. Review your assessment and revise it if it is necessary on a regular basis. Now that we've learned the 5 steps, let's go over them in more detail. Number one, identify. What are the risks? What areas pose actual or potential risks? Some examples: criminal activity, political groups or faction groups, health or medical issues like hepatitis, typhoid or malaria, or physical facility security. Number two, determine. After identifying the areas of actual and potential risk, we need to determine the impact of these risks on the organization, on personnel, on assets, and even on reputation. Number three, evaluate. This is the process to determine if adequate measures have been taken, and if not, what needs to be done to provide the maximum amount of safety. We want to become a hard target. Number four, develop. Based on the identified issues from the first 3 steps, you will need to develop contingency plans to deal with and mitigate the risks. Number five, review. It is very important that we have a plan in place with a process for periodic reviews of our risk assessment. How often should you redo the assessment? It's a good idea to put it in writing. 1 year, 2 years? It should increase in the amount of time that you do it with how high the risk is. The higher the risk, the more often you do an assessment. Let's talk about matrices. Why would you want to use a grid or a matrix? It's common to use a matrix when you want to understand 2 different variables, when you want to measure 2 things at one time. Many organizations utilize a matrix for assessment and another one for responding to risk. We want to be more efficient than that, so we'll look at how to use a matrix to measure both. We have to be able to qualify risk. That's going to be the left-hand column as we build our matrix. This will help to put the risk into one of 5 common categories. We want to also quantify risk. That's going to go across the top of our matrix. We will be measuring the magnitude of the risk, the impact on our people and our organization in descending order from left to right, from worst to least risk. One of the biggest reasons we want to create a matrix is so that we're able to assign a number value to events and to risks. This gives us the ability to measure through qualifying risk and quantifying risk how big of an event it is and how big the risk is. Over time, we need to be able to come back to our matrix and look at our grid to find out if anything has changed. Has the risk gone up? Has the risk gone down? This will change how we react to risk at this point. That is why risk assessments need to be done on a regular basis, constantly adjusting and mitigating different risks at different times with different responses. As I said before, we will be using 5 categories: health or accident, natural, criminal, political, or electronic. Regarding the threat levels, you will see them run from 4 down to 1, 4 being the lowest, 1 being the highest risk. Let's talk about the 5 areas. Health or accident can be described as when the threat is medical or man-made accident-oriented, like a car crash. Number 2, natural. The event is from a natural cause, like a flood or a hurricane. Number 3, criminal. When the person doing this to us is acting in a criminal manner. Number 4, PR or political, public relations. When the act against the organization is of a public nature, the act or allegation that changes public perception of the organization or leads to liability. Number 5, electronic. In today's day and age, risk can come from the use of electronics, for instance, spam, a virus attack, or a hack on our computer systems. Once we qualify the risks an organization faces, we need to quantify them in order to respond appropriately with planning, abatement, spending, and effort. We need to quantify in order to make plans for the crisis, minimize, abate the risk that can be reduced if it is reducible, identify where resources are spent first to reduce the highest risk, which is the whole reason for the matrix. Identifying the highest risks to be able to respond to them the hardest and the quickest. Identify where policy and procedure and facility changes are needed first to abate the highest risks. The grid, or matrix as we call it, will show that to us through a numerical output. Items that have the highest numbers will need to be dealt with the most. However, they can also be the hardest to deal with. Items that have a low score on the matrix typically are the easiest and fastest to fix, but they also usually cause the least amount of damage. Quantifying risk. What is the magnitude or the impact of the risk for our personnel or for our organization? We're going to place it into a threat 1, a threat 2, a threat 3, or a threat 4 category. Remember that threat 4 has a lesser impact and threat 1 has the greater impact. Many times a matrix will be color-coded in order to quickly identify the different threats. This is called a risk assessment grid. As stated before, a risk assessment should be reviewed and revised on a regular basis. This will be determined by how big the risk is. Don't forget to schedule this so that you don't forget to do your next assessment. When you do go back to do a review, it's easy to be lazy and not actually go through the steps to identify risk. You need to re-identify, recheck sources for where information came from, then redetermine the effect on personnel and the organization, reevaluate the risk and decide if the existing measures are adequate, update and respond as needed. The typical risk management cycle looks like this. It could start at any phase because it is a cycle. Identifying hazards, applying controls, reviewing effect, and assessing risk. Notice that it then begins the cycle all over again. Unfortunately, assessing risk is a never-ending job. Experts have identified the importance of what is known as the risk management cycle. You start with a focal point, which is a person or department whose job it is to understand, track, and identify risk. That focal point, either with a team or an assigned team, tries to identify and assess the risk that are facing an organization. Often, when that is done, it all stops if there is not a focal point where the info is dumped off to be moved forward. The focal point then either through their department or hands the information off to a team, like the board of directors, who reviews the assessment information and develops policies to address the problem. This could be policies requiring training of members, buying of equipment, reassigning personnel, or reassigning finances wherever it's actually needed. Once policies are in place, then the focal point is given those policies back and either does training with personnel or completes the tasks in order to abate the risk. Again, the focal point keeps the process moving. Without the focal point, it is found that things fall to the side and stop. So best practices in risk management cycle will rotate around the focal point. The focal point will assess risk and determine needs, monitor and adjust, educate, and implement the abatement policies and procedures. So let's build a risk assessment matrix. We're going to utilize threat 1, threat 2, threat 3, threat 4 definitions that we've already created, and we're also going to assign them numbers by frequency. Is it frequent? Does it happen a lot? Is it probable or likely? Is it occasional? A remote probability that it's going to happen? Or it's not likely, or it's improbable. Notice that the numbers go from 0 in the bottom right corner and gradually get higher as they go up to the upper left corner. A lot of times, this matrix will get colorized in order to show how the threat increases. Let's take a look at a sample risk assessment grid and 4 sample threat levels. You'll need to write your own in the class. In threat level 1, it has the most severe consequences, the greatest impact. Multiple people are dying. In threat level 2, it still has a great impact. Maybe the monetary value of things that happen are not quite as high as in threat level 1, and fewer people have died. Threat level 3, the monetary value has decreased again, and less people are injured or hurt. In threat level 4, has the least impact, minor injuries, small dollar amounts were involved, not great impact of resources. We need to find the average for each event. So for instance, let's look at earthquakes. In threat 1, we decided that many people would be dying in this event. How probable in our area for the organization would this be probable? The area where I live, it's not very likely to have an earthquake that kills multiple people. So it gets rated as a 6. If an earthquake happened, could a couple people be killed? There is a remote possibility, so I'm going to rate that as a 5. In threat level 3, I'm going to assess that one person could get injured severely, and that could happen occasionally, so I'm going to score it as a 4. And threat 4, remember, is the least of all of the threats, and I believe that, once again, it might happen occasionally, so it's going to get scored as a 2. Once I have evaluated all the natural events, I'm going to score each of them and tally up what the total score would be. Here you can see the total score is 76. And there's 20 boxes in our grid, so we're going to divide 76 by 20 to get an average of 3.8. Having the average allows us to track for changes. We'll begin plotting each one of the events on our chart here, and over time we can quickly see if something is changing, especially if it's dramatic change. We need to reevaluate the risk and try to mitigate that risk depending on if the risk is getting higher or lower. Now we can go back through each one of the event categories and apply the same principles to each one to get an average to be able to plot on our graph. By the time we are done, every event has been given a threat level and also a numerical value so we can track how much it changes over time. We will be able to evaluate whether or not we need to implement more policies and procedures or changes to mitigate the risk that is involved.